This is the first video in a 4-part series where we're going to be building a top headlines news app using the NewsAPI.org's API. In this first video, we're going to be creating our app with an iOS 14 target. And in the process, we'll be securing an API key that will be required for us to make the API requests, along with creating a model struct that we can use when we decode the JSON retrieved. And we'll utilize an APIService class that I created in a previous video and test it to make sure that we can decode the data. And then as a bonus, I'll introduce you to a fantastic new Mac app for creating your app icons. In the second video, we'll be building out the UI and testing some basic functionality to make sure that the app runs successfully under iOS 14. In the third video, we'll start by adding source control and then create a development branch. And then we'll open our app in a version of Xcode that supports iOS 15 and make some changes to use iOS 15 specific APIs. And we'll introduce the ability to check for availability and then fall back to iOS 14 code if iOS 15 is not available on the device that's running the app. And in the final video of the series, we'll add a new feature that will allow us users to change the source country. And this will be available for both iOS 14 and 15. And then finally add a pull to refresh control that will retrieve additional news articles for the specific country. So as a quick preview of what we're doing, here's a little promo video that I put together. Now before I get started, let me request that if you enjoy this video, please leave a comment below and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Make sure you ring the bell to be notified of new videos, and if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. If this is something you want to learn, then keep watching. Originally for this series, I was going to use a free API for fetching headline news that uses no API key. And this was one of the APIs provided by Jordan Singer, the developer of the great airport app for discovering test flight apps. It's his LilSoftware API. LilAPIs is a nice little set of API endpoints that you can use for testing JSON parsing and URL sessions on your own. The NewsAPI looks like this, and it was exactly what I needed. Its origins are from the much larger NewsAPI. And it would appear that Jordan is just rerouting the request by using his own API key for the NewsAPI. And though this might work for you as an individual, if we were to release a tutorial using this, it wouldn't be long before that shared key would reach its daily quota. So you're going to have to get your own API key, because I'm going to keep my key secret from you. Fortunately, this is a simple process. Let's go to that news site right now, and I'll leave the link in the notes below. Now I'm going to have to register to get my own API key. That's easy to do with this tab. Now I've already got one, so I'll just have to log in. My key is here, and it's hidden. Now if you check the pricing tab, you'll see that a developer account is free. That's great. And with it you get 100 requests per day. So that account is perfect for what we need for testing. Everyone will have 100 chances to query the API every day. So go to the Documentation tab and under Endpoints, click on Top Headlines Endpoint. And here you'll see the endpoint provides live, top, and breaking headlines for a country. Make note of the country codes as you may wish to alter the endpoint to find news for your country. I'm going to be using CA, for example, for Canada instead of US. So copy the endpoint URL from the definition, and your API key is already entered, and save it somewhere so that you can have access to it later. Now paste it into the browser URL field, and it'll generate the JSON feed. Now this is a single JSON object that has 3 properties: status, total results, and articles, which is an array of objects. And we're only interested in the articles array and only some of the properties here. More on this in just a minute. So let's create an Xcode project. I'm going to call mine Top Headlines, and I'll make sure that it's a SwiftUI project. Now, I like to keep my hard-coded information like the base URL, my country, and API keys in a separate constants file as static properties so that I can easily find, access, and change them as required. So create a new file called constants. In that file, create an enum called constants so that we can use as a namespace. And in there, we're going to create 4 static properties. One will be a computed property. Now, locate that URL that I asked you to save from the NewsAPI and paste it temporarily into this file, comment it out for reference. And you can see that the country code by default is US, but we can change that. So first, create a static property called base URL and copy and paste the part before the question mark and paste it in as the string value for this property. Next, create a property called country and enter as string your desired 2-letter code. So in my case, it's going to be CA. For the third property, create one called API key. And copy and paste your key as the string value. And then finally, we'll create a static computer property called endpoint that is a string. And it's composed of 3 different parts, along with the parameters. Self.baseURL plus, and then in quotes, question mark country equals, plus self.country, plus, and then within quotes, and API key equals, plus finally, self.API key. This endpoint then is our string URL. Now let's return to the JSON in our browser, and it's time to create a model for our data. I'm not going to use any tools like Ducky or one of the websites that can help you generate a model. I'm going to do it by hand because this is actually a fairly simple structure. So first of all, let's create a new file called news, and inside there create a struct called news that conforms to the Codable protocol. This is our complete object. Now, as I said before, we're going to ignore the first 2 properties, and we'll create one for articles that will be an array of objects. But first, we'll need a struct to represent that. And we can do that as an embedded object. So create a new struct called article that also conforms to the Codable protocol. The first property of article is another object that's called source. And it is another object, so we'll need to create one more embedded struct called source that is also codable. But we're only interested in the name property here, and that is a string. We don't need the ID property. So now for our Apple struct, we'll need a source that is of type source. Next is author, which is of type string, and I know from experience that this can be optional, so I'm going to make it an optional string. Now, it may be wise to make all of your properties optional and deal with those cases as they arise, but to save us some time here, I'm going to tell you which ones should be optional and which ones will never be. Next, we'll create a property for title, and it is a string, and it isn't optional. Next, description, and it's an optional string. We follow this by URL, which is of type URL. And then for our image, the URL is URL to image, which is an image URL, but it can be optional. So we're going to make it an optional URL. And finally, published at, which is a date. But note in particular that this date is in ISO 8601 format. So we'll need to know that in just a minute when we make our API call. I'm not going to be displaying the content, as the description is all that I want for my display. And finally, now we can create our articles property, which is an array of article. And that completes our news object struct. Now this video is not about JSON parsing, as I have in other videos spent a lot of time going over that. I have an entire series on that, and I'll leave a link in the notes below. In another video called APIs, Codable Protocol, and Result Type in SwiftUI, I create a reusable API service class. Now we're going to use this class in our project, so I've provided a GitHub gist for this, where you can copy the code from it. So let's go there now. Take a look at the raw value to make it easier to copy, and copy it. Back in Xcode now, I'm going to create a new Swift file called APIService, and I'm going to paste the code into that file. Next, we'll create a view model for our application where we can create a function to access that class and to decode the JSON, and then assign that decoded array of articles to a published property that we can display in a list. So we'll create a new file called newsViewModel. And inside there, I'll create a new class with the same name and make sure that it conforms to the observable object protocol. We'll start off with just a single published property called articles that is an array of news.article, and we'll initialize it as an empty array. Next, I'm going to create a function called getNews, and this function will be calling the APIService's shared getJSON function. Now this function requires a URL string, which is our constants.endpoint, but also we have to pass in our date decoding strategy, which is .ISO 8601. I don't need the key decoding strategy. I'll tap enter on the closure and it will be a result. And since our API service is using generics, we'll have to specify that the result enum is news and APIService.API error. Next, we can switch on result. In the case of success, we get a news object. And we can assign news articles to self.articles. And then, as a test, I'm going to print the number of articles we find. And I know there should be 20, which is the initial load that the API provides us. In the case of a failure, I'll just print the error's localized description. Now we've got what we need to test. In Content View, we'll create a state object that we'll call ViewModel that will be an instance of our newsViewModel. And next, I'm going to attach an onAppear method to our text view. And within the body, I'm going to call the ViewModel getNews function so that when it starts up, it should fetch all of those articles and assign them to our published property, which in turn, we will print out the count. So let's run this on the simulator on our iPhone 12 Pro. If all goes well, we'll see that the data gets decoded and the number 20 is printed on the console. Great. I notice also though I'm getting a thread warning. And that's because I'm updating the published property on a background thread, and that's no. So let's enclose this in a dispatch queue.main.async block so that it will execute on the main thread. Now I also see some other information printed to the console, and that for me right now is irrelevant. These are OS activity mode outputs, and I can disable those if I want. And the way that you do that is you click on the scheme and choose Edit Schemes. Click on the Run tab and add a new environment variable. For the name, enter all in capitals OS_activity_mode. And for the value, you can type in disable. If you run this one more time now, all you see is 20 as the output. There are no warnings and no extra console output. Now this is totally optional, but I'm really excited about this new app by Jordi Brun called Bakery. Currently, all of my test apps give me a white icon on the simulator's home screen. And this is because we have no app icon assets in our assets folder. And it can start to look pretty ugly after a while and hard to find which app is which. Wouldn't it be nice if we could generate a quick custom icon for each of our apps? Well, Bakery does just that. You can find it in the App Store. It's a work in progress, and the UI might look a little different by the time this video is released, but right now it's still fantastic. I plan to do a full video on this app once Jordi has reached feature completion, if that ever is. But let me show you how easy this is. Let's open the app and you'll see what I mean. I can choose a nice colored background to generate a pleasing icon, and I can pick either an SF symbol to overlay or an emoji. You can also drag and drop your own images onto the icon. For example, I'm going to use an emoji and I'll search for news. I can tap on that emoji and it adds it as the overlay to my preview. I like this gradient red background, and so I'm going to choose to increase the size of the overlay. I also want to add a badge that I'm going to name Demo and add it to the bottom right corner. I'm done. Let me move this aside now and bring up my app and make sure I'm at the Assets folder, and I'll delete the current empty one. Now, with both windows viewable, I can simply drag and drop directly from Bakery into this window. And voila, I have a new custom icon. Let me run the app once now. When I return to the home screen, no more white icon. Great. We can now move on to the next video and start to build out the UI for our app.